It's France. It's Denmark. It's Tunisia. And it's Australia. It's Group D. And it's the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. Now we are going to move on to part 3, and we'll begin with just a reminder of this, a summary of their history and a look at their form going into this cup. So we'll start with France. So overall, France is not as consistent as other top teams are, at least in their qualifications and records of reaching the cup. Their peaks seem higher, and apart from the current period of strength, they are represented by the influence of a particularly great player, allowing us to identify the Jules Fontaine years around 1959, the Platini years around 1985, and the Zidane years stretching from 1998 to 2006. But the valleys also seem lower, with their worst period from 1962 to 1980. In recent years, though, those valleys have not been as severe and have come in the form rather of terrible lapses in the cups in 2002, 2008, and 2010. However, recently they seem to be enjoying a fourth strong period.
Yeah, the period from 2008 to 14 was flat and uninspiring rather than being a period of notable weakness. But as has always been the case, hosting pulled them out of it. And second place in the 2016 Euro Cup was followed by a World Cup victory in 2018. It featured a strong team with many good players, but not an identifiable leader like in previous good periods. Euro 2020 was a disappointing round of 16 finish, and the 2022 World Cup qualification was uninspired with 3 draws in a fairly weak group, though they did finish a clear first. The 2022-23 Euro Nation League is going poorly as they lead into this cup, and despite being grouped with arguably almost all second-tier teams in Denmark, Croatia, and Australia, they nevertheless face relegation, or the prospect of it, to League B.
Right, and that's Austria.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. All right, well, that's France, and moving on to Denmark, I'll start with a summary, and then Connor will talk about the form. So, apart from a fourth-place finish in 1964, Denmark didn't reach a tournament, either World Cup or Euro Cup, until 1984. From that time, they reached about half of the World Cups. They gained a reputation for doing well once there, passing the group stage 4 of the 5 World Cups they reached. Euro competition is better on the whole, though. They're more consistent in reaching the cup since 1984, missing only twice in a flat period between 2008 and 2016. In Euro Cup play, they've dropped at the group stage about half the time. However, when they have gone beyond the group stage, they've done excellently, reaching the semi-finals 3 out of 4 times in 1984, 1992, and 2020, and going on to win the title in that amazing 1992 campaign.
The flat period between 2008 and 16 in Euro Cup play was reflected in 2006 to 2014 World Cup play. They came out of it, though, with a round of 16 finish in the 2018 World Cup and a semi-final finish in the 2020 Euro Cup. That puts them at a peak of form, and they currently stand first in their UEFA Nations League A group, which started with a win in France.
Right. Moving on to Tunisia. Tunisia has had 3 peaks. Once at the beginning of their career in the mid-60s, where they finished in the top 3 in 2 of their 3 African Cup appearances, and the next in 1978, where they both reached the World Cup and took 4th place in the African Cup, and finally around the turn of the century, where they qualified for 3 World Cups in a row and won the African Cup as host in 2004. However, they had a long flat period from the mid-60s to the mid-90s, with 1978 being their only success. In recent times, they've continued to qualify for the African Cup, and they remain competitive in World Cup qualification, but they have not gone beyond the quarterfinals in the African Cup since 2004. And I think I'm correct in saying they've never passed a group stage of the World Cup. Is that right, Conor?
That's correct.
Right. So recent results may make current times a fourth peak of their strength.
Yes, Tunisia were not weak before 2019 as they had been the previous century. They regularly reached the quarterfinals of the African Cup. But given the quarterfinals was their ceiling and they had not reached the World Cup since 2006, it was certainly an inglorious period. Breaking that ceiling with a fourth place finish in 2019 and two successful World Cup qualifications in 2018 and 2022 is an improvement in form. Add to this a second place finish in the reinvigorated Arab Cup in 2021, which promises to become a fairly major competition, and the future for Tunisia is boding well.
All right, I'm going to finish with Australia. Australia's dissatisfaction with the OFC, the Oceanic Football Confederation setup, is illustrated by their limited opportunities to reach the World Cup. They qualified only for the 1974 World Cup between 1966 and 2002. The OFC also afforded them little opportunities to hone their skills against strong opposition. Moving to the AFC in 2007, moving to the AFC had been their solution all along, and it seems to have been a good decision. However, the AFC's concerns about making the region too big were valid, especially considering that it threatened to open the gate to island teams stretching half the way to South America. Their worries that Australia would dominate, though, have not come to pass. They are a strong team that regularly takes one of the World Cup spots since joining in 2007. However, they only took the half spot in 2018 and 2022, a quarter spot, actually. They did not dominate the Asian Cup, again doing well, but winning only one title when they hosted and appearing fairly benign in 2007 and 2019, where they only reached the quarterfinals. All in all, though, they seem a well-integrated member of the Asian Federation now.
Australia are among the top-tier teams in Asia, although this is coming into question in recent years. They never dominated Asia as some thought they might. But the thought was more valid when they joined in 2007, having just passed the group stage of the 2006 World Cup. Since then, though, they only won the Asian Cup when they hosted in 2015. In 2018, they finished third in the final round of qualifying behind Japan and Saudi Arabia, although they still made it to the World Cup, beating Syria and Honduras in playoffs. And it was a very similar situation again this time around. In 2019, they were undone by second-tier teams in Jordan, who beat them in the group stage, and UAE, who knocked them out. Their ranking has also dropped from the 20s in 2012 to around 40 in 2019.
All right, well, that brings us on nicely to our next section, where we do take a look at the rankings. So do you want to take us through it, Conor?
Yeah, so starting with France, the Pot 1 team, they're currently ranked 4th in both the FIFA and ELO systems, and they've been in the top 4 really since winning the World Cup in 2018. So consistently ranked among the top teams in the world.
Yeah, they took a drop after 2010, so this is a good period for them, but yeah.
And sure.
To Denmark.
Yeah, Denmark are 10th in FIFA and 9th in ELO, so both systems have them a top 10 team in the world. We mentioned Denmark having a flat period to kind of 2016 when their rankings were much lower, but they've actually been a top 20 team pretty consistently from December 2017 onwards.
Yeah, and actually before that too.
Right.
Okay.
Tunisia. Tunisia is currently 30th in FIFA and 45th in the ELO system. Any comments on Tunisia historically?
Yeah, they've kind of really never gone below, I think 60, around 60 is their lowest No, I actually say that they have been as low as 80. So again, I would say they're at a fairly good point in their career.
Yeah, and that's reflected by kind of a recent rise, especially in the ELO system.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, Australia are ranked 39th according to FIFA and 43rd in ELO. So the ELO system actually has Australia ahead of Tunisia, though they're behind them in the FIFA rankings. And Australia, it represents, I guess, a bit of a fall from recent times due to some of their, I guess, struggles in qualification.
Yeah, I mean, that's been going on for a while, I'd say over the last 5 years. And before that, they were pretty solid in the 20 to 30 range. So as opposed to Tunisia, a bit of a weak period for them.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's take a look at head-to-head. These teams haven't played each other that much, coming from different regions. But do you want to give the overview, and I'll add any specifics?
Yeah, so France has a winning record against Denmark, though it's close. France with 3 wins, 1 draw, and 2 losses.
Right, and the last time they played was in 2018, where they tied 0-0. And before that was way back in 2002, so probably not relevant.
We should mention that this is the 4th time that France and Denmark have been face each other in the group stage of the World Cup since 1998.
Yeah, so that's right. And actually, at this stage, they have an even record of
yeah, 1 win, 1 tie, and 1 loss.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, France and Australia.
Yeah, France have never met Tunisia, but France have met Australia twice, and they have a record of 1 win and 1 loss.
Right, so in 2018, actually, France won that game 2-1, but in the 2001 Confederations Cup, Australia beat them. I'm not sure how relevant that is anymore.
Yeah. Denmark and Tunisia have never met, but Denmark and Australia met once. And that was in the 2018 World Cup group stage.
Yeah, and they tied 1-1.
And then Tunisia and Australia have met once. That was in the 2005 Confederations Cup. Tunisia won the game 2-0.
All right. These teams have met each other a couple of times in the Olympics, but we really don't cover that in this podcast. So we're going to move on to odds. And Connor talked earlier about where they come from in the group. Do you want to summarize that?
In their pots, do you mean?
Yeah, in their pots.
Yeah, so France and Denmark are both kind of in the top half of their respective pots. And then there's a bit of a gap. Tunisia, the bottom ranked team in pot 3, but by rankings, truly a pot 4 team, and Australia just a little bit behind them. So they're both kind of essentially 2 teams that are pretty close to pot 1 and 2 teams that are kind of close to the opposite end in pot 4. And in terms of that kind of division, we see that reflected in their odds. France are given 93% odds of advancing beyond the group stage. Denmark have almost a 65% odds, or 2/3 odds of advancing. And then Tunisia and Australia have a 24% and about 27% respectively. So Australia slightly favored in the odds to advance.
Right, slightly favored in ELO 2 and slightly behind in FIFA rankings. Okay, well, let's take a look at the groups. Any comments on the schedule of games there?
I think in general, it can be favorable to play the strongest team with a pot 1 team last, just because they may have already qualified by that point and could perhaps play a B team. So in that case, that possible advantage goes to Tunisia, who meet France in their final game.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it might actually turn out that Australia has that advantage if Denmark, beat France like they did in the recent UEFA Nations League Cup.
That's right.
Okay, well, overall, I kind of see this group as split into 2. I mean, you said it with the pots there, that France and Denmark there seems to be a gulf between France and Denmark on the one hand, and Tunisia and Australia on the other. Would you agree with that, or do you think the weaker teams can overcome that?
I do. I think the gulf is pretty large. I mean, we have two top 10 teams in the world, two teams that have done really well in their recent tournaments. France winning the 2018 World Cup, Denmark getting to the semifinals of the recent Euros, and Tunisia, Australia, do well to get to the cups, but generally don't get past the group stage. Tunisia never have, there's a bit of a gulf in the rankings, and I think it will be difficult for Australia or Tunisia to really challenge the top two.
I agree. I think there's, an outside chance of them kind of stealing a result, but I don't see them really stealing second place.
Yeah.
Rather kind of battling for third between themselves. Maybe we'll talk about that, but do you see France as the clear kind of winners here?
Not clear. France have, as we kind of talked about, have a very up and down history, and they have at times failed spectacularly, including the World Cup after their last win. They won in 1998 and crashed out in the group stage without scoring a goal the next World Cup. So it's possible, but I think whereas France have been inconsistent, I see their current team perhaps less vulnerable to that, and they have been a bit more steady since 2016. But that said, Denmark are perhaps marked by consistency and very strong showings at tournaments. So, I don't think France, to answer your question, I don't think France are clear favorites to win this group. And their most recent meeting in the Nations League, which Denmark won, I think is a clear indication of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think France has by far the most talented squad. But they've often had talent, and the question is whether they can bring it together. And there have been a few cups where they kind of failed to bring it together, as you say, kind of spectacular lapses. And that happens often enough. I think that there's a bit of a concern here that France may be overconfident, as you say, which may have been the problem in 2002. And you compare that with Denmark's consistency. I mean, I just meant to add there that France a bit inconsistent in qualifying too, as opposed to Denmark, who don't have as many big names, big stars, but they have kind of teamsmanship to make up for it. In fact, do you know how many players play for Brentford in England? Because they kind of seem to be gathering there.
Yeah, Christian Eriksen did last season, but doesn't anymore. But they have a Danish manager, and I know they have a number of Danes, but I don't know how many.
Yeah, nevertheless, I mean, it might not be a huge factor, but even without that, they pretty much know how to play with each other, and that kind of proved true in the 2020 World Cup, Euro Cup, where they were kind of brought together by Christian Eriksen's heart attack on the field there, and that really seemed to kind of mold them into a strong group. So I gotta say, Connor, I'm almost thinking of picking Denmark as the winners over France here, but I don't think France would fall out of second place.
Yeah. Do you think Denmark are worthy of their top 10 ranking, which both FIFA and ELO seem to agree on?
That seems a little bit high to me, and if we look at it historically, Denmark tend actually not to have strong performances twice in a row. In fact, this is the only time, this 2018 and 2022, the only time they've qualified for two cups in a row. And if we look at the Euro Cup, they've never passed the group stage for two times in a row. And here, if we look at between cups, they have sometimes qualified for two cups in a row. But this is the first time they've done it for three times. So I don't know how significant that is, but I would say a team that's ranked in the top 10 should be kind of a consistent consistent in showing up at the finals or reaching the quarterfinals. So would you say that they're historically stronger now? I mean, by what I just said, that would say they're at a historical peak almost.
Yeah, I would kind of agree that they are historically stronger now. You know, coming out of a kind of a flat period, they've done well and are very strong in qualifying campaigns as well. Very strong in the Nations League, coming off a good Euros, which was recent enough. And I think they've kept that core of the team together, and they know how to play together very well. So, yeah, I think they're a strong team and perhaps a dark horse for later on in the tournament.
Possibly so. Do you think they're strong enough to overcome France here?
I think it's certainly possible. We see with some big teams it sometimes takes them a bit of time to get going in a tournament, and that could be the case with France. You know, when France and Denmark meet in their second game, I see a tie as being quite possible, and then it kind of comes down to potentially even goal difference. So I think it's quite plausible that Denmark can win the group.
All right. Well, looking at the bottom half of the table, FIFA prefers Tunisia, whereas the odds makers and ELO prefer Australia. What think you?
I think Australia are coming in at a bit of a weak point, as we mentioned. Even looking at some of their players, obviously Tim Cahill was a talisman for them, but they don't seem to have kind of big players playing on as big teams as they have in the past.
Yeah, Schwarzer.
Yeah, others like that. So they've been dogged by a bit of inconsistency. So I don't see them as, yeah, kind of at a strong point in their history. You know, Tunisia, you know, for them, it kind of looks a little bit like their last World Cup group where they had England and Belgium together, two strong European teams, and then them and Panama kind of fighting out for third or fourth place in the group. And that's exactly how that group played out, although Tunisia did give England a scare. So I don't see either team being quite good enough to challenge, though taking points off, you know, for both Tunisia and Australia, taking points off the top two is not out of the question. I just don't see it being enough to get out of the group.
Yeah, I got to say I'm a bit worried about Australia's form coming into this cup. We saw their qualifications, you know, finishing third in the Asian group and having to qualify through playoffs, although they did well in those playoffs. The 2019 Asian Cup, you know, some teams can say they were steamrolled by Qatar, but actually Australia was knocked out by UAE. I guess they were the hosts. When I look at their players, though, I think that's a real concern, especially in terms of scoring. Whereas Tunisia have a couple of scorers, Wabi Kazri, and you know, they don't seem to have that same problem that Australia has scoring. Australia have had it over the last couple of tournaments, and I don't really see a solution there. Like Jamie McLaren's okay, but he's not a Tim Cahill, you know.
Yeah.
So as we're talking here, I think when I started the podcast, I was kind of feeling that Australia had the edge, but now I'm beginning to have my doubts.
Yeah, I think Tunisia, they had the experience of playing in Qatar. It's going to be a more familiar environment to them, and they may have some backing as an Arab country. So again, it's not by any stretch a home advantage, but there might be elements of that come through for Tunisia.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Australia does play these Middle Eastern teams in their region, but we saw their road record in 2022 was quite weak. So I think you're right. Tunisia will have an advantage, both climate-wise and kind of feeling more at home.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you know, I've been putting up with your ducking and dodging here, but now it's time to ask you to give it to me straight, Connor. How is this group going to turn out?
I'm going to say France win the group ahead of Denmark. I think it's possible that they're tied on points, but if it does come down to goal difference, I give France the edge just with the players they have. So France first, Denmark second, and I'm going to go Tunisia third, Australia fourth. Though again, it's possible that those two may be tied on points as well. But I think Tunisia have a couple things in their favor, a bit more on the rise, a bit more at home. And I think, yeah, it's possible that they finish third.
Yeah, I gotta say, I came into this. Well, I'll start with. Actually, I'm going to pip Denmark over France. I think their consistency is better. Not that I think that they'll go further in a tournament than France necessarily, but I think their consistency will win out in the group stage. And I came in thinking Australia and Tunisia, but I'm going to agree with you there. I think Tunisia have a couple of advantages, and I think particularly Australia's difficulty in scoring goals will see them finishing in last place.
All right.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the podcast, and we really appreciate you listening.
Yeah, those who are unfamiliar with our podcast might want to keep listening for some information about further listening. But if you're turning off now, we'll say goodbye and hope that you'll tune in to our next podcast in the series.
All right, great. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, further listening. We've done 9 different series of podcasts if you're interested in a deeper dive. Some of the information may be dated, but some of the histories focus on different aspects of the team histories, so it can help you to get to know teams more intimately.
Yes, as mentioned, this is our 10th series, and we have done at least one series on every region except Oceania. We have files for that region too, and we'll do one down the road so as not to leave them out. But let's go region by region.
Right, so Europe, our first series was a group-by-group podcast on the teams of Euro 2020. That was played in the summer of 2021. And for South America, we also did a group-by-group podcast on the teams in Copa America 2021.
For North America, we have done 3 series on CONCACAF. The first was a group-by-group podcast on the teams in the 2021 Gold Cup. That included a look at Qatar. The second was a preview of the 8 teams in the final round of World Cup CONCACAF qualifying. That came with our first player series, where we went team by team through the players. The third was an update halfway through that qualification.
Yes, and for Asia, we did a group-by-group podcast on the 12 teams in the final round of World Cup qualifying, and that included a deep dive into each team's World Cup qualifying history.
We have done 3 series on African teams. The first was a group-by-group podcast on the 24 teams in the 2021 African Cup, played in early 2022. The second, done around the same time, was a team-by-team series on the players for each of those teams. Third and finally, we have recently concluded a series on almost all teams in Africa, a group-by-group examination of the 12 qualifying groups for the 2023 African Cup. This included a deep dive into their African Cup history, which was quite extensive. This provides a look into some of the lesser teams that rarely even qualify for the African Cup.
Right, and we realize that not everyone is interested in the level of detail that we go into. So starting from that series, the 2023 African Cup series, we're editing our media casts into shorter versions. Generally, for groups and teams, this will just be a summary and discussion segments of the longer podcasts. And for the player ones, just the sections on the squad's overall strength and a list of the main players that we expect to reach the competition. So that's usually 2 or 3 groups per episode.
Yes, otherwise each long version of the series contains a deep dive into the matter at hand. So if it's African Cup qualification, for example, it's a deep dive into the team's history of African Cup qualification. Or if it's the World Cup qualification, a deep dive into each team's history in qualifying for the World Cup.
Right, and all of those podcasts can be found in our library at soccerphiles.captivate.fm. That's Soccerphiles with a PH in the middle and an S at the end. And we also provide a link to our website and other relevant material in the show notes for each media cast. And in general, to find us, you can type Soccerphiles Canada into Google, and it's easy to find your way from there. Or just check out the show notes for this or any of our media casts, and it'll be easy to navigate from there.
Okay, see you in our future media casts.